The sky had been clear that morning, practically glowing with promise for a perfect day's hike. In the early hours, light filtered through the tall pines, and the earthy scent underfoot reminded her of childhood wanderings. Marianne felt an eager flutter in her stomach at the prospect of shedding her city burdens and finding solitude among deep green canopies. She had dreamed for years of taking a long trek through these lush woods, forging her own path and discovering something about herself along the way. In her mind, the forest would bring clarity, as it had so many times in her youth. She had been confident in her own stamina and sense of direction. She had grown up with a compass in hand, after all. But nature has ways of testing a person's mettle. And before the sun marked midday, she was beginning to realize that she might have overestimated her skill. At first, she hadn't been concerned. A missed turn here, a slightly overgrown trail there. These missteps seemed small and trivial. She would push through tangled undergrowth, trusting that her faithful compass was guiding her back toward the trail. Every new clearing gave hope she could find a well-worn path. Inevitably, though, the clearings revealed only more dense stands of towering pines and birches. The terrain looked the same from every vantage point. Thick moss carpeting the ground, tree trunks layered with fuzzy lichens, boulders covered in emerald ferns. Her map, a carefully folded page from a worn guidebook, had proven little use in the labyrinth of similar landmarks. The hum of cicadas grew louder near midday, merging with the distant calls of birds. The once comforting melody of nature now felt all too expansive and alien. The rest of the world seemed a lifetime away. She checked her watch and found it had stopped working an hour before, the dampness of her sweat interfering with its function. With her water supplies dwindling and no sign of an official trail, she felt the first notes of panic. This was the sort of situation she had always believed she was too smart and prepared to stumble into. But here she was, heart pounding, scanning the horizon for anything resembling a way out. As afternoon slid toward dusk, the air began to cool. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, distorting the shapes around her. She shivered, pulling up the collar of her jacket. The rolling landscape didn't offer her a vantage point, just a ceaseless parade of tree trunks. When hunger gnawed, she ate a protein bar in hurried bites, feeling tension mount. Fear threatened to burrow under her skin. How many times had she read cautionary tales of lost hikers who had wandered too far, never to emerge from the world of green and shadow? She reminded herself that calmness was key. Experience told her to build some form of shelter before dark. There was an inkling of hope in her chest. Tomorrow was another day, and if she found some higher ground, she might be able to spot a ridge or break in the trees that would help her orient herself. She'd get out of the forest, of course she would. She had done this kind of thing more times than she could count, though usually not alone, and usually not so unprepared for the subtle illusions of the woods. Marianne gathered sturdy branches, layering them in a spot protected by a cluster of large rocks, hoping they would shield her from the wind. She took out her flashlight to check her surroundings. It cast a small circle of light that cut through the gathering darkness. She blinked in the dim glow, listening for any sign of animals that might consider her an unwelcome intruder or an easy meal. The forest seemed silent save for the night creatures waking in the underbrush. Then, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead in a breathy hush, and she felt an unexpected chill. She settled into her makeshift shelter, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. There was a sense that something was watching her. She tried to reassure herself that it was only the typical sensation of being alone in a vast wilderness, but she couldn't entirely shake her unease. She was used to communal hikes, group camps, and well-traveled paths. Now, the wild truly was vast, and she was isolated in its hold. Closing her eyes, she clutched her flashlight like a lifeline. Perhaps if she slept, morning's light would bring clarity, and she could correct her course. Time passed in an uneven drift, defined by restless bursts of dozing, followed by quick jolts awake. She was straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. Every so often, she sat up to flick on her flashlight, scanning the tree line for glowing eyes or menacing shapes. She had just begun to settle into a deeper sleep when a foreign light seeped through the boughs. At first, she believed she was dreaming, but as she opened her eyes fully, She realized the strange light remained steady, pulsing like a lantern's glow filtering between the trunks. Marianne held her breath. It could be another hiker, a ranger, or even someone trespassing on private land. She parted the branches of her small shelter, wincing at the cold air. The pale yellow glow continued bobbing in the distance. Could she risk investigating it? A flicker of relief surfaced at the thought of encountering another human being. Perhaps they had a cabin or at least a map. Yet caution urged her to move slowly. She felt oddly protective of this small space she had fashioned. Something about the beckoning glow felt strange. The light moved methodically. It didn't sway the way a typical flashlight beam or cell phone torch might. It had an almost old-fashioned aura to it, as though it were indeed the flicker of an oil lantern. That in itself struck her as peculiar. Dismissing the thought that it might be a mere hallucination or wilderness spirit, Marianne stood. Her legs ached from crouching in place for so long. She carefully picked her way toward the source of the glow, listening for footsteps or voices. As she drew nearer, the light revealed that it was not merely floating in midair. It hung from the outstretched arm of a person whose features were hidden by deep shadows. The figure wore a thick cloak or coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, but those details were difficult to distinguish. Moonlight was scarce under the canopy. Marianne was certain, though, that there was something almost timeless about the silhouette. If she had been transplanted to an earlier century, she wouldn't have been surprised. She called out softly, "Hello?" There was no immediate reply, prompting her to speak a little louder. "I'm lost out here. Can you help me?" The hooded figure slowly turned and raised the lantern, as if lighting the space around them to better see her. Marianne bridged the distance, heart pitter-pattering with hope and unease. She could now see a weathered face, lined with age and experience. The figure was an older man with kind eyes, but he remained quiet for another moment, studying her as carefully as she was studying him. Finally, in a soft voice, he answered, "Hello, traveler." Marianne couldn't help but sigh in relief at the sound of another human voice. "I need to find my way back to the main trail," she explained in a shaky voice. "I got turned around and my map is practically useless. My compass might still work, but I'm not even sure where to head anymore." The man nodded, and the gentle glow from his lantern revealed a faint smile. "A lost path can be the beginning of a story, you know," he said. "But I'll guide you." He used his free hand to gesture into the darkness. "We'll walk together until we find a place of safety." His words were simple, yet something about them struck her as unusually formal. He didn't ask who she was, where she came from, or how she'd managed to lose her way. Marianne decided not to press him with questions either. The relief she felt was overwhelming. The tension in her shoulders eased. Maybe, just maybe, she'd get back to civilization by morning. They set off through the woods, the lantern light cutting a tunnel of visibility through the thickness of night. Marianne checked her phone, hoping for a signal, but the device was dead. She slid it back into her pocket, focusing on placing her feet on relatively level ground. Despite the man's decades-older appearance, he moved with a confident, sure-footed grace through the gnarled roots and unexpected slopes. The night air carried a new briskness, and Marianne's breath formed small clouds as she trod behind him. It occurred to her that the lantern's flame was unwavering, untouched by the wind that occasionally gusted through the trees. Still, she dismissed it as one more odd detail in a strange night. The older man occasionally turned his head to verify she was still behind him, but mostly he stared straight ahead, as though he trusted the forest to guide his steps. After a stretch of silent travel, they arrived at a small clearing near a nearly dried-up creek bed. A sad trickle of water carved a path through wet leaves and collected in dark puddles. The man bent down, gesturing that Marianne should do the same. She knelt and filled her water bottle. When she brought the water to her lips, it tasted of mineral-laced earth, but it was quenching, and she felt a spark of rejuvenation. Her guide remained quiet. He simply lifted the lantern higher, watching her. "Thank you," Marianne said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "You just saved me from serious dehydration." His response was almost cryptic. "The forest provides." Then he extended a hand to help her up. She noticed the weathered texture of his skin, rough like bark, as he lifted her to her feet. They continued walking. She tried to make small talk, mentioning that she'd come from a city where the skies were bright red at night with neon lights, but the man did not elaborate on his own life. Eventually, she stopped peppering him with questions. She settled into the quiet rhythm of walking, lulled by the bobbing lantern. The night seemed less threatening now, accompanied as she was by a guide who exuded both calm and mystery. Time slipped away, unmeasured except by the ache in Marianne's calves and the general exhaustion creeping into her bones. At last, through the black columns of the trees, she spotted another glow, a small cabin set against the trunk of a massive oak. Its windows glowed with warm lamplight. Relief flooded her chest, and she couldn't repress a broad smile. Civilization, or at least a semblance of it. The older man guided her to the cabin's humble porch, where an old rocking chair swayed gently in the breeze. "Wait here," he murmured, pushing the door open. The inside glowed with an orange flicker, likely candles, or an oil lamp, Marianne guessed. She waited, peering in from the doorway. The interior appeared cozy, furnished with a small table, a sturdy rocking chair, and a tidy cot against the wall. He reappeared with a folded blanket and beckoned for her to sit at the table. Marianne entered, the wooden floor creaking under her boots. She took a seat while the man stoked a small fire in a potbelly stove, placing the lantern on a side table. Its light mingled with the dancing flames, casting a comforting aura. Marianne realized how grateful she was to feel warmth and see sturdy wooden walls around her instead of endless pines. She hadn't imagined stumbling onto such a place. The man poured steaming liquid from a kettle into a mug and handed it to her. She took a tentative sip. Her eyes widened in pleasant surprise at the herbal blend's complexity and soothing warmth. It seemed as if it was brewed from wild forest herbs she couldn't identify. "Rest," the man advised gently. "You've walked far. If you like, you can lie on the cot by the fire." She glanced at the bed. "Are you sure it's okay?" she asked, guilt creasing her forehead. "I don't want to impose." A trace of a smile softened his features. "You are meant to be here," he said simply. Then he covered the lantern with his palm, protecting the flame. The glow in the cabin was now primarily from the potbelly stove's fire, which crackled in a friendly way. Marianne settled onto the cot, wrapping the blanket around herself. The exhaustion she'd been battling all day weighed heavily on her eyelids. She wanted to ask the older man's name, but as soon as her head touched the makeshift pillow, she felt sleep tugging her into a deep, sudden rest. When she woke, sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. She sat up abruptly, taking stock of her surroundings in broad daylight. The cabin seemed simultaneously small and infinitely comforting. She noted a rough wooden shelf on the wall, holding a mixture of aged leather-bound books and jars of dried herbs. The potbelly stove remained, though now it was cold to the touch. The older man wasn't inside. She placed the blanket neatly at the foot of the cot. "Hello?" she called softly. The only reply was the forest's morning chorus of birds outside. Her heart pounded. Had he left her alone out here? Then she spotted a folded note on the table. It read, in careful script, "Continue to trust the light. Head north from the cabin. You will find your way." She looked up, scanning the cabin again, and there, resting near the stove, sat the lantern. Its glass edges were chipped in places, and the base showed signs of rust. She couldn't quite remember if the man had used it when he guided her inside, or if he'd placed it somewhere else. A perplexing wave of le vu swept over her. Something about this scene felt as though she'd walked into a living relic from a storybook. Nevertheless, the instructions were clear. She pushed open the cabin door, stepped into the crisp morning air, and found the forest shimmering beneath a gentle sun. She had no sense of which direction was north. On instinct, she took out her compass from her jacket pocket and found it was working once again. The needle steadied until it hovered resolutely over the cardinal point. She inhaled, squaring her shoulders. It was quiet, far quieter than she'd expected, as though the cabin existed in its own pocket of stillness. She took a final glance over her shoulder, silently thanking her absent host. She suspected he might be out gathering supplies or perhaps tending to something further in the woods. Maybe he intended not to interfere as she found her own path. She resolved to leave him a note of thanks, but she had no pen or paper save for the one he'd left. She decided she'd carve a small message in the cabin's threshold. Leaning down, she found a piece of flint and etched the word gratitude across the lower beam. Satisfied, she set off. At first, each step felt tinged with uncertainty, as though the woods might shift around her the moment she looked away. But as she followed her compass north, she stumbled onto a faint footpath winding along a ridge. The trees began to thin, letting in swaths of golden morning light. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and squirrels darted across the higher branches. She looked back occasionally, half expecting to see the old man trailing behind her, lantern in hand. Each time, she was met only with the gentle hush of wind. Eventually, the path widened until it merged with a far more structured trail, one with signposts. Marianne nearly cried with relief upon spotting a weathered wooden sign reading Bristlecone Trail 1.5 miles to Cedar Point. Apparently, she was close to the official hiking route. With her spirits lifted, she continued, letting the pounding of her heart diminish in the comfort that other hikers would soon appear. And appear they did. About half an hour later, she encountered a young couple, their lively dog bounding ahead of them. They greeted her cheerfully, mapping out the route back to the main entrance of the forest. She was only a day's walk from the nearest ranger station, perhaps less, if she was all right. They asked if she was all right. She must have been disheveled or visibly relieved. Marianne smiled, explaining she'd gotten a bit turned around but had found help. She described a cabin with an older man who offered shelter for the night. They exchanged glances, puzzled. "We've hiked this route for years," said the woman. "I'm not aware of a cabin in these parts, at least not an inhabited one," Marianne shrugged. "Maybe I wandered further west or just got lucky. In any case, I'm safe now." She bid them well and continued on her way. As the day wore on, Marianne's mind drifted back to her mysterious guide. She remembered how surreal it had seemed when nothing about his lantern faltered in the wind. She recalled the herbal brew that soothed her so perfectly, as though it had been crafted for her alone. The memory sparked a quiet wonder in her chest. Had she been included in some silent miracle? She arrived at the ranger station just as the sun dipped below the horizon the following day. Exhaustion tugged at her muscles, but relief was stronger. The rangers were kind and offered her a place to rest for the night. They also assured her that search parties had not yet been sent out, given reports of perfect weather and her general hiking experience. Marianne politely recounted her story. To her surprise, a few of the older rangers exchanged knowing glances. One ranger, an older woman named Harriet, spoke up. "There used to be a hermit living deep in those woods, decades ago, dressed all in old-fashioned clothes carrying a lantern. I've heard stories from local elders who said they received help from him when they were children, but I'm not certain if anyone's seen him over the last 20 years. She paused, a curious gleam lighting her eyes. Some folks whisper he's a spirit who appears to guide travelers in need. Marianne felt goosebumps rise on her arms at Harriet's words. "I thought he was just a reclusive woodsman," she said slowly. Harriet nodded. "Maybe he is, or rather was. But you're not the only one to tell a story like that. What's odd is the mentions of a cabin that no one can ever seem to locate once they try to find it again." A strange flutter stirred in Marianne's heart. She had been ready to believe her rescuer was simply a kind old man, but Harriet's calm sincerity made her wonder if there was a deeper side to these woods, a sacred guardianship offered to those truly lost. Had her gratitude, scrawled on the threshold, reached him? She hoped so. The rest of her stay was uneventful. She got a good night's rest, and by the following day, she took a park shuttle back to the city. Weeks passed, but Marian's thoughts often drifted to the forest. She could still picture the cabin's rough-hewn walls and the unwavering flame of the lantern, a beacon in the shadows. Every retelling of her experience was met with various reactions: skepticism, curiosity, even awe. Her dreams frequently swelled with images of that hush in the night, the quiet arrangement of trees, the gentle lines of the old man's face, and the single lantern that had shown her the way. She found herself obsessively studying wilderness lore, scanning antique shops for lanterns reminiscent of the one he'd carried. She located a battered antique piece, not identical but close. She placed it in her living room, its presence a tribute to that magical salvation she still struggled to comprehend. Eventually, Marianne resolved to return to the woods, not to wander without direction, but to leave a formal thanks. She packed a small rucksack, complete with the standard gear, some offerings of dried food, and a humble wooden figurine she'd carved as an expression of gratitude. It was a simple piece, carved into the shape of a lantern, symbolizing the guidance she had received. Her plan was to visit the approximate area where she believed the cabin might lie and leave the offering in a safe place. She notified the rangers of her return trip, letting them know she was only staying a day or two. This time, she brought a fully charged phone, extra batteries, a functional radio, and an updated GPS device. She was determined to stay safe, yet a soft part of her hoped to glimpse that light again, that ephemeral glow that had banished the terror of being lost in the dark. On the first day, she roamed the main trail, branching off near what she guessed was the route to the hermit's cabin. She followed the creek's path, recalling the dried bed that had guided them in the moonlight. Early morning turned to late afternoon. A gentle hush enveloped the forest. Despite her best efforts, she found no sign of the cabin. No footprints, no old kettle or potbelly stove. The path she'd remembered so vividly seemed to shift beneath the watchful gaze of the trees, concealing all evidence of that hidden haven. Finally, she paused in a small clearing, aware that evening would arrive soon. She set the carved wooden lantern at the base of a grand pine. Taking out a small slip of paper, she wrote a simple note of thanks. Guiding light, thank you for showing me the path. May your kindness shine for others. She placed the note next to the carving, almost embarrassed at how sentimental it was. But she felt no shame in expressing honesty and gratitude for a person or spirit that had saved her life. When she rose to her feet, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Just for an instant, she imagined she felt a presence, like someone standing just behind her, tranquil yet watchful. She glanced over her shoulder, but only the tapestry of foliage greeted her. Shaking off the fleeting feeling, she set her compass bearing northeast to return to the trail. The sun was dipping below the horizon by the time she saw the faint glow of the ranger station in the distance. Birdsong gave way to dusk's chorus of insects. She felt a gentle contentment settle into her bones, as though she had finally repaid a portion of her debt. And though the surroundings were growing dark, she didn't feel afraid. A lingering certainty persisted, that she had once and for all tethered herself to the thread of light that had guided her in her darkest moment. Some nights, when city lights cloaked the stars and traffic roared below her apartment window, Marianne would close her eyes and remember the crystalline silence of the forest. She would picture a hooded figure traveling through the tree-lined darkness, lantern lifted high to guide the way. That memory melted away, her daily stresses reminding her of the profound gift of rescue she had received, and of the power of trusting the world to provide help when you need it most. The following spring, she decided she would return once more. She wanted to keep searching for truths buried in the forest. The mystique of her savior, the hermit or spirit, remained, leading her to embrace the unknown as something beautiful rather than ominous. In each step forward, she carried the humility of one who has been lost and found, along with a sense of reverence for the forest's secrets. And though she never encountered the lantern-wielding stranger a second time, the lessons he offered remained etched in her heart. That amidst uncertainty, one spark of guidance can be enough. That in the presence of kindness, gratitude can bloom into deeper understanding. And most importantly, that sometimes the universe presents an unexpected guiding light, ushering a wandering soul to safety when all hope appears to have fled.